Bon, on va y aller. Bonjour.
Good afternoon, everyone. One more minute, perhaps, for those who want to sit down.
Voilà.
Here we are. So, hello, everyone. Thank you for being here in such great numbers. I am Sylvie Kaufmann from Le Monde, and I am going to be moderating this debate around Joe Biden and the new challenges for the United States.
Voilà.
So, the timing for this panel was decided a long time ago, but it's the perfect timing because the United States are at the center of all the storms, all the difficulties. I'm not talking about the one outside, which is hitting Normandy at the moment, but we thought that some calm would come after the Trump hurricane we had for 4 years. And now with the placidity of this veteran in politics, as is Joe Biden, the new president, we thought that we would have more serenity in this political and unsettled landscape. But that is not the case. For 9 months now, we can see that inside and outside, the obstacles are continuing and the difficulties and the challenges are huge. We have seen this once again at the Congress last night, the battle over this gigantic recovery plan for infrastructures, which is being launched by the President Biden. And it was once again at the heart of heated debates within the Democratic Party and with the Republican opposition. And I think Joe Biden was facing a non-acceptance of his plan. So the COVID crisis is not over yet. There is still the challenge of vaccination, which is not over yet. And on the outside, his policy towards China is crushing almost everything, including relationships with European allies. And we will talk about it in details. France was the subject of the recent agreement, American and Australian British agreement. We saw the retreat of the troops in Afghanistan. We noticed that things were not simple on this front either, and we see that immediately after after 20 years of presence of the Americans, the Taliban are settling back in the country, and nothing much has changed, it seems. So we have other deadlines, the G20 in Rome, the COP26, of course, with the important challenge of the environment, which is a difficult one as well. So this is the framework for our discussion today. And now we are going to discuss about it with you as well in the room. But first of all, with Susan Maloney, who is going to speak to us remotely. She will speak to us from Washington, and she will be with us on the video conference. I hope you can hear us well. There's rain here. It's noisy, but I hope you can hear us. So Susan Maloney is Vice President and Director of the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. And it's a very important institution for reflection, and they're working on Iran, a country on which he wrote several papers, several works. We are here also with Jean-Marie Guénaud, who lives in New York but is professor at the University of Columbia, former Secretary General at the UN, Foreign UN Secretary General. He published a book, The 21st Century, an analysis, remarkable analysis. I'm not saying this just because he's with us, about the state of the world, the situation, and the fragmentation. And then Nicole Niezotto, who you know very well. She is a professor at the CNAM, and she is holder of the European chair, and as well vice president of the Institut Jacques Delors. She also has written very good books, including some on Europe. So next to me, Benjamin Haddad,
Ambassadeur au fond.
our officious ambassador in the United States. He was not called back. He is here as a volunteer, and he is the Director Europe at the Atlantic Council in Washington. He is a great expert in transatlantic relations, and he published 2 years ago a book, a very interesting book on this topic called Paradise Lost, Paradis Perdu in French, on the world of Trump. We will listen to them, then discuss among ourselves, then with the audience. But first, I would like to give the floor to Susan Maloney, since she is giving us the honor of being with us today. Susan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm very honored to be part of this discussion. I apologize that I wasn't able to join you in person in Normandy. I'm sure I would much rather be there than here in Washington, despite the storm. And I really look forward to hearing the perspective of the distinguished fellow panelists here today, especially my colleague at Brookings, Jean-Marie. Per the guidance of our moderator, Sylvie, I will be speaking to the question of the Biden administration's foreign policy through the prism of the issue of Iran. And I think in many ways this offers an interesting lens and an important lens to understand the approach of this administration, because it is an issue and a crisis that predates this particular administration. We can, in fact, look at how the Biden administration's policy compares to its predecessors, all of whom have spent a great deal of time and effort trying to address the challenges posed by Iran. And I think it's also a good lens because while it has been to some extent in the background of American foreign policy since January, my expectation is that it is going to elevate in importance over the course of forthcoming months, especially with respect to the transatlantic relationship. So let me just say several points, and then I will look forward to listening to the rest of your conversation here today from my seat here in Washington. First of all, I think we all understand that the Biden administration began its term in a very familiar place for American presidencies. That is, in a standoff with the Islamic Republic of Iran. That has been the case for every American president, really since Ronald Reagan was inaugurated just at the moment that the American hostages in Tehran were freed in 1981. The standoff this time around was very different. It was in many ways precipitated by the United States, by the Trump administration's decision to withdraw from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and to reimpose sanctions not simply at the level they were at during the Obama administration, but what was described as maximum pressure, an attempt to drive all Iranian oil exports from global energy markets and to reduce Iran's oil revenues, which are, of course, a central piece of its government budget, to zero. In fact, the Trump administration had some success in applying these sanctions. But it had very little success, of course, in driving Iran to end its nuclear program or to stop some of the other policies of concern, especially around the region and especially with respect to Iran's treatment of its own population. And so the Biden administration came into office needing to rehabilitate the nuclear deal to address this intensifying crisis around the region with respect to Iranian influence and malfeasance. But it had to do so in a very different context than all of its predecessors. And I think it's completely clear and understandable that the administration came into office recognizing that the priorities were different. The priorities, of course, were trying to contain the pandemic, trying to address the global and domestic economic issues and concerns that were fairly fraught earlier this year, and to deal with other cross-cutting priorities like the climate crisis and racial justice. Like so many issues for the Biden administration, Iran does not occupy the same level of focus, I think, for this administration as it did for either of its most recent predecessors, either President Trump or for President Obama. And yet what we see, I think, consistent with a President Biden himself who has more foreign policy experience than any of his recent predecessors, is that a senior and very seasoned and I think very wise team was put in place, and an effort was made and an effort has been underway to try to address the standoff with Iran, not seeking a breakthrough, not seeking a sort of Nobel Peace Prize level new rapprochement or different kind of relationship with Iran, but simply seeking to repair the damage of the Trump administration. And again, I think this is consistent with what we've seen from the Biden administration on a number of other fronts, especially as the priority has shifted in terms of regional interests and in terms of the threats posed to the United States away from the Middle East and focused more on great power competition, and in particular, the threat of China and other techno-autocracies and what they may mean for the international order. So Iran is a problem to be managed rather than the major focus for an administration. If you may recall, a former American Secretary of State spent weeks almost monopolized by the Iranian nuclear negotiations in 2015. We can't imagine Secretary Blinken doing anything like that at this time. Despite the fact that there has been, I think, a very serious effort on the part of the administration, the desire and the plan and the priority to try to restore the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action to full compliance by both sides has not succeeded. And there, I think we simply have to recognize, once again, the context has changed. Some things broken cannot be repaired, despite what I think has been a good faith effort by the United States, a reasonable and serious plan from the diplomats who are charged with this issue, and of course the efforts to work closely and collaboratively with allies and partners around the world, and especially the parties to the deal, the EU3, and the other members of the UN Security Council. There, I think we have to lay the blame at the feet of Iran. And this is, I think, the challenge that we're going to be facing. My time will be ending very shortly, and I don't want to impose on our fellow panelists, but let me say that I think we're going to be faced with a crisis very soon on Iran. It's quite clear that irrespective of the domestic politics of the Islamic Republic, the leadership in Tehran has made a strategic calculation that their interests are better served by not coming back into full compliance with the deal, if only to try to drive a better bargain and more concessions from the United States and the international community. We now have an Iran that is perhaps a month or even less away from being able to produce enough fissile material for nuclear weapons capability. Obviously quite further away from actually being able to assemble a weapon itself. But that breakout timeline was intended to be a year under the nuclear deal, was intended to give the international community some space and opportunity to address a potential rush for a bomb by Tehran. We don't have that space any longer. And we are going to have to develop what I think is, at this point, an absolute urgency around a plan B, a different approach, because what we've seen is the efforts to negotiate with Iran have not, in fact, been successful, and they're not likely to be successful under the current circumstances. I'll just end by listing a couple of dimensions that I think will be essential to any alternative plan for dealing with the challenge of Iran. The first is that it absolutely has to be explicitly and robustly multilateral. We have more than 4 decades of experience of recognizing that unilateralism does not succeed with respect to Iran. We have to be approaching this challenge as a united international community, and especially united around the transatlantic alliance. Secondly, I think we have to recognize that despite the importance and urgency around the nuclear issue, the challenges posed by Iran are not limited to that question. And we have to be working with our regional allies and partners around Iran's threats that it poses around the region. There has been a diplomatic dialogue that has improved over recent years between Iran and its neighbors, but it's yet to really produce what I think is absolutely necessary, and that is a greater freedom of action for some of the countries where Iran has exerted influence through its militia proxies. And finally, I want to say that on Iran, while diplomacy has to be the centerpiece and it has to be a consistent element of how we approach this challenge, it is not our only lever of influence with respect to Iran. And we've been able to see that whether through covert action by friends and partners around the world, or whether through other means of influencing Iranian decision making, we can have some constructive impact on Iranian policies over time. With that, my time has now ended. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to have been with you today, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the discussions this morning. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Susan.
Thank you very much, Susan Maloney. I have a question for you.
Puisque vous nous avez...
Since you very well explained this question of Iran, although it is crucial, you said that it is in the shadow of the competition or rivalry of the great powers of the world. But if I'm not mistaken, China was one of the signatory countries of the agreement, the JCPOA, on the Iranian nuclear. Do you believe that this gigantic rivalry of the great powers, superpowers, is it bad news for the chances of making progress for these negotiations?
I think that the rivalry between the United States and China and the tensions that exist complicate our policy on Iran tremendously. Because, of course, one of the reasons why Tehran has calculated that it does not need to rush back to the deal, that it might be able to receive better terms, or that it in fact might be able to continue its own nuclear activity outside the restrictions of the deal without suffering catastrophic economic consequences, is precisely because the Chinese have been importing upwards of 1 million barrels a day in oil from Tehran in violation of the American sanctions that were put back in place by the Trump administration and that have remained in place under the Biden administration. And so the Biden administration is faced with a very difficult choice. If they want to intensify pressure on Iran and try to create some incentives for negotiating and for coming to the table in a serious way by the Iranian leadership, they need to find a way to increase economic pressure once again on Tehran. And that requires either cooperation from China, or it requires a decision by the Chinese to, or a decision by the Biden administration to target Chinese entities and individuals with American sanctions. And of course, that falls into a much broader discussion given the state of the relationship. Is that a risk the Biden administration is prepared to take? So far, that does not appear to be the case because there are so many other interests and concerns at stake. And this, in many ways, I think is constraining the Biden administration's ability to make progress on Iran. But again, it offers an opportunity. If the United States, particularly if there's engagement and support from the other parties to the deal, especially in Europe, I think there's the possibility of bringing the Chinese along because in the end, nobody wants Iran with a nuclear weapons capability. That serves no one's interests. And the Chinese were party to the deal, as you say, and part of the negotiations throughout the Obama administration, and they share that interest. And it would be to the benefit of regional and international security if the United States and China could find a way to cooperate in a strategic fashion on this issue.
Okay, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I think it's sunny in Washington, so have a good day there. Thank you very much. Benjamin, now I would like to go back to the United States, American policy, among the different challenges that the administration is confronted to. Of course, we have the political challenge, the domestic challenges, and we have seen in January the issues in Washington. We see that the ambitions of Joe Biden are confronted to many constraints in the interior policy. We are far away from the, not far from the midterm elections. Could you describe this landscape to us? Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. It's true. It's a political landscape which is very divided, polarized. Joe Biden was elected in the context we know well after President Trump, and there are still issues today because the administration is running late in terms of nominations for positions, and this means a lot of time was lost when the dossiers weren't transmitted by the Trump administration. And of course, the crisis of January 6th, which deeply struck the minds of Americans, the Americans are still haunted by Donald Trump's ghost, so to speak. So the social networks were Donald Trump's favorite platform, and he is still very popular among Republicans. And when we look at the polls, if the primaries were held today, people who like Trump still like Trump, and when he limited masks and other restrictions linked to the coronavirus in Florida, for example. We have this Republican Party, which is still strong and marked by populism, nationalism, and systematic opposition to the Democrat Party. And a Democrat Party, we must say, which has also its silos, fractures, different ideologies. Joe Biden comes from the moderate wing, liberal internationalist of the Democrat Party, and he must also work with this progressist wing as well. We saw the popularity of Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders as well, and embodied today by very popular visible personalities such as Mr. Cortes at the Chambers of Representatives. What is interesting, and I think that this will link us to foreign policy, I think that Biden has understood to a wide extent how the elections work, the success of Trumpism, and indeed for a part of the Democrat electorate, those who deserted the Democrats. And one of Trump's great successes was to have gone beyond the blue wall, the blue belt. States which in the past were the industrial lung of the United States, Ohio, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, states that were not competitive in 2016, but that Trump managed to pull on his side. And of course, there was deindustrialization, globalization, robotization as well, and also a loss in terms of employment due to the machines. Biden understood to avoid Trump coming back, he also had to work with this electorate, and therefore massive investment. We talked about foreign policy, China, transatlantic relations, but we mustn't forget that Joe Biden's legacy, if there is one, his objective is to have a domestic policy. So this will be visible within the infrastructures, and this sends us back to foreign policy. We can see, well, a permanent link between foreign policy and domestic policy. Recovery, infrastructure, innovation, and competition with the superpowers and China. So one of the stars of the Democratic Party has shown that investing in green economy or fast trains, we are pointing we are underlining, showcasing the Chinese investments, and it will be an important tool for competition for the great superpowers. This leads me to say a word on foreign policy, of course. It's just a few weeks after a strong crisis between France and the United States. The ambassador was called back to France from Washington for a special consultation. He just traveled back to the United States. It's the first time in 140 years of bilateral relations that, for the anecdote, the United States had called for the ambassador to be sent back under George Washington. It was the ambassador Genet who was accused of interfering and pushing the Americans to go to war with the British. At the time, Genet, that was in 1794, was facing the guillotine in France, but he was granted asylum in the United States and ended up as a farmer. So I think it's an unprecedented crisis. We don't have ambassadors in certain countries because the people haven't been appointed yet at the Senate, and namely by Ted Cruz. I think there are structural factors for that, and we will mention them again. I think that in the last years, perhaps we insisted too heavily on Trump's strange personality, the scandals, the polemics, the insults, without seeing that he also was an accelerator of pre-existing trends, changing priorities. Susan mentioned the new diplomatic priority of the United States, of course, focusing on China, the focus, and the priority given to competition with China, maybe the only topic of agreement in Washington, and also looking at Europe and the Middle East. And we can see the spectacular consequences of the retrieval from Afghanistan. And the transatlantic relations will be seen also under the light shed of the relations with China. So we need to balance this to
compétition stratégique avec la Chine. On a eu il y a quelques jours.
A few days ago, we had the first commercial and technological council between the United States and Europe to have common standards, common investments on microprocessors, for example, on looking at investments with China to counter China. And I think there are long-lasting consequences for Europe about these priorities, and I think we will talk about this more in depth later. Thank you very much, Benjamin. Nicole, I will move on to you now. Benjamin mentioned the transatlantic issues, Franco-American issues, but that goes beyond these issues. And not only the French are experiencing problems. What if Joe Biden wasn't the one we thought he was, or is it just the continuity of foreign policy in America that is confirming?
Je crois que s'il y a eu une révolution.
I think if there was a revolution in foreign policy in America, it was with Obama. Obama was leading it, and when he announced clearly that the main objective of American diplomacy was what he called the Asian pivot. That was a true revolution, and Europeans understood, or didn't want to understand, that from this point, Europe was not the center of the American world. We've known for a long time we're not the center of the world in general, but really understood, or we should have understood, that we were not the center for Americans. And we discovered, or we already knew the roller coasters. Now we're discovering the American roller coasters, and it means that the administrations are changing and diplomacy in America is changing towards the Europe, sometimes at even 180 degrees. So we had threats. We were told either you're with us or you're against us. And with Obama, of course, all of Europe fell in love with Obama because he corresponded so much to European values. Then we had Trump's brutal, the enemy that we couldn't understand. And he would say the enemy was EU. Then Joe Biden, with Joe Biden, we thought it was going back to something more quiet with good intentions. And what we're discovering is that it's not an every 4-year change, but now within the same presidency, the first 6 months that we have the democratic America we like, benevolent, pro-European, etc., working on the climate, negotiations with Iran, etc. And then, since July, an America that really looks like Trump, very similar, leaving Afghanistan without any former agreements. And I'm talking under the control of our ambassador there, a unilateral decision to leave Afghanistan, a treason for France, or at least working with Australia to break the contract with France, and then an informal alliance with the United States, United Kingdom, and Australia. And we discover that this continent, the United States, we thought was our best friend, is not, because it has this obsession with China, and he is adding two things that Trump didn't have. First, Trump had a strategy towards China, which focused on trade and sanctions. Biden has a strategy towards China that is focused on everything. It's a global one. It's not only based on trade, not only on sanctions, but on containment, creating alliances. Trump was occasionally anti-Chinese, but Biden, for him, it is more in the long term, creating alliances on intelligence between 4 countries on regional cooperation. And we see that Biden is adding what Trump hasn't really done, meaning putting NATO in a failing position in Iran, and because of the new, and NATO is the heart of the American presence in Europe. So I believe Americans can be worried or surprised, and it's not unilateralism that is coming back. On the one hand, the stupidity, because these decisions are counterproductive. He's leaving Afghanistan when he wants to have an alliance against China. He is not disagreeing about an agreement with France, so it's not the moment to have a fight on this. And so all of this is extremely contradictory, and Europeans are asking questions or wondering about these points. And I believe there are 2 clans, so to speak: the hyper-conservatism, Atlantic conservatism, and it's going. The more NATO is in danger, the more NATO will be marginalized, since the new alliances that the United States is creating with China. We cannot give new reasons for the United States to go even further in its lack of interest for NATO. We need the United States to keep a strong interest for the EU. First attitude. And second attitude, it's the opposite. We could think the more Europe is changing, the more the United States are going to work alone. And that's an attitude that France has defended, to be autonomous, European autonomy, because 70 years ago, de Gaulle was the only European to think that the United States wasn't a trustworthy ally.
On a ces deux clans
So we have these two groups, these two clans,
vers une grande.
and for Europe, it seems they want to go towards a more autonomy in terms of strategy, but Europeans, when things go wrong, they want to be protected by the United States. This will be an important point. And secondly, this vision that the United States is trying to defend, going back to a bipolar world between the Western world and China, the American leadership on the one side fighting for democracy and against Saudi Arabia, and with Saudi Arabia, and we know that this confrontation between the Western world and China, is it meaningful when we are European? That is a true question. It is not an easy question for Europeans. We see that on certain topics, we were closer to Chinese than Americans. On climate, global warming, for example, it was the case. On other topics, especially for policy and strategy, it's obvious that we are closer to the American side than to the Chinese side. But it is a true question. Is Europeans' interest in the future to be close to a vision of the world that separates the planet into the good and bad, if we can say things as such? Is it in our interest? Should we not rather defend at least a vision of the world with three partners, us Europeans, the Chinese, or we have a model to defend, we have an identity. That's the second great European debate. And we saw that at NATO when he came in May this year. Joe Biden obtained, so that in the last communique, with a reference to China and he said he obtained to have rule of law, but Germany is the country that has the most trades with China. After the Opus affair and the submarines business, I'm not sure that Europe will accept this vision of the world, and I believe that it is not in the interest of Europeans to want to build a world that is based on a binary opposition, them, us. We ended this with the Soviet Union, and I don't see why we would want to go into this system once again. So I think the two great European debates in the coming years will be this. Are we becoming more and more autonomous while coming closer to the Americans, or do we believe that NATO must be unchanged for another 20 years? And we don't change? Or are we able to articulate a vision of the world that is more complex, a little more sophisticated than this simple division? Thank you very much. I will give the floor to Jean-Marie Guénaud, who is going to react to what you said, to this vision that you presented, Nicole. Are we indeed, because of the American stupidity, to quote Nicole, condemned once again to a binary world, or is there something else that could emerge or come up?
Americans' stupidity, I don't think they have the monopoly for this, which is probably one of the problems. I think this crisis that Benjamin Haddad was talking about, the American democracy crisis, is a crisis of all democracies. We should look to ourselves as well. Everywhere, democracies are sick. Maybe it shows more in the US. They have more power, more than other democracies. So therefore, we look at them. It's magnified, if you like, by the impact and of what the U.S., the impact of the U.S. on the rest of the world. In the last few years, the major event was the election of Trump. This was domestic policy, and I think the repercussion, the consequence of this event will continue. It shows, in a sense, the idea that democracy is the ultimate point of history.
de nos sociétés.
and that it would be in the gene of our society with the election of Mr. Trump.
Peut-être pas, parce qu'il y a
Maybe it won't be. More and more Americans are concerned about the possibility of a new Trump election, and there are scenarios which are not utopia that could lead us to imagine this. With Trump's election, we saw that democracy could become hatred, fragmentation of the society, a society where 70% of Republicans don't believe the result of the election is a real result of the right results. We see these kind of things being magnified in the US, but this is also the case in other countries. So what does that mean for international relations and for us as Europeans?
puissance américaine pour reprendre
American hyperpower, to use Mr. Vedrin's expression, is a hyperpower with agile feet. It's fragile, both internally,
mais là aussi elle n'est pas la seule.
but it is not the only one. If you look at the world, you could also describe it as a decline, a competitive decline of the nations. Let's look at the Europeans. It's not much better. Let's look at China. We could talk about the China triumph, yet China is an aging country. Xi Jinping is trying to take over the large companies, which could become a challenge. It's a country where there is an increasing number of issues looking at 15 years ahead. So we do see fragility in the main hubs in the world. Now, Western democracies also struggle with a question of identity. For America, you could sum up it as a leader of the free world. This motto, if you like, is more a way of answering the American people's anxiety rather than a real concept. What has been said about the last crisis is actually an illustration of this mindset, and that's more concerning. The continuity between various administrations like the Biden administration and Trump, I think, let's be clear, it's much better to have Biden than Trump, no matter Biden's weaknesses. Biden has come back probably a bit too late in order to save the nuclear agreement. Still, he still thinks that the structures holding the world together are still useful somehow. He's not making much effort to reinforce these things, yet he's not demolishing things like his predecessor. That's the main difference. However, the risk is that in all of these countries going through crisis, identity becomes a priority, and the easiest answer is nationalism, and that's what's concerning me the most in our world as it is today, in the relationship between US, Europe, China, Russia, is a rise of nationalism in Europe. What is strong as European is becoming more and more difficult, and I agree with Nico Nisotto on that point. The fear of taking one's responsibility and being suspicious of any distant institution means that you close yourself on yourself. Today we talked with a lot of emotion about what's happening in Afghanistan, but I was thinking about what happened at the end of the Vietnam War when the Americans hosted about 1 million of Vietnamese. I think France had about 100,000. As of today, we would say if we were to welcome about 1,000 of them today, we would feel like heroes. Yes, nationalism is dangerous. And what we're seeing even more dangerously is the erosions of the international norms. This morning in the plenary session, I think we heard from either the Brazilian ambassador or someone else talking about the importance of maintaining the basic foundations of the UN, simply to defend oneself. This is not the case anymore. We are seeing assassination. We see people doing this, cyber attacks. blurring the distinction between peace and war, the use of proxies and militia
plus courant.
is more and more current, and the border between war and peace is becoming thinner and thinner. And in a way, we're getting used to this. We're getting used to the idea of violence in our language, in our actions. If you put this together with the nationalism as a refuge to find one's identity, I think it is very worrying indeed. Thank you.
Parce que je voudrais
Don't just stop quiet, because I want to come back to you about what you said. You mentioned the role, the status of the U.S. as being a leader of the free world, and that we could imagine they will want to continue to do that. Facing China is not just strategic or technologic. It's also a strategy.
Alors, comment est-ce qu'on reste le
How do you stay as a world leader
système politique dans l'état où il est actuellement?
with the political system as it is? Indeed, when you put together the two, you come with an issue. The summit of democracies is not that easy, actually.
On devrait nettoyer un peu.
We should be cleaning, everyone should be cleaning their own yard.
Là, je vais être un peu provocant.
Maybe I'm going to be provoking when I say that, but regarding all the other countries which do not want to be part of this battle, which do not want to have to choose between China and the USA, some aspects of China can be very appealing. The main difference between the Cold War
La guerre froide avec la Chine.
and the new Cold War with China, the former Cold War with Russia, the URSS, it was not very appealing. People could see it was a failure, economically speaking, whereas China is much more attractive, and it's very appealing to a lot of countries, which can see in China a great success, the way they came out of poverty and took millions of Chinese out of poverty. This is very visible. Chinese people affirm this new power, and they're very arrogant about it. And they are not making many friends because of that, even including in Africa. But there is a temptation to do this in the Chinese model. The way China maintains social peace, of course, there is pitiful repression. We are horrified by what's happening to the Uyghur people.
Crisis Group, j'avais nommé
I appointed someone in China before, and that person spent 2 years in prisons without seeing his family. So there is a high level of repression, and we should not be ignorant of this. Yet, on the other hand, there is another aspect of China, which is a futurist aspect, which is even more scarier, in my opinion, which is how they brainstorm the mindset, how they brainstorm totalitarianism, such as Hitler or Stalin, through the manipulation of perceptions. Maybe one could convince people to be happy according to an happiness that would have been defined in advance on their behalf, like a dog that wouldn't feel that it has a neck collar because the wolves would have disappeared. That's a possibility which may be appealing to many dictators, but also to societies which are destroyed from within because of permanent conflict, which is why the battle between China and the free world, as we would say today, this battle is actually a lot more complex, more complicated than the previous battle wars before between the U.S. and the Russian bloc. So thank you very much, Benjamin. Maybe we can come back to Washington in this discussion. In all these challenges that we are facing in the U.S. and here in Europe, could you tell us a bit more about the political team of foreign policy around Joe Biden? Since the start, we think that Tony Blinken is a great friend of France. He's a French speaker. He studied in France, but The reality is that it's not so much the case. We also have the foreign policy for the middle class, which was elaborated as a concept. Could you tell us a little bit more how this works? A quick word on this, and I'd like to react after the previous comments. But yeah, Tony Blinken, when we were appointed as head of state or state secretary, is a state secretary of the U.S., is also the historical associate of Joe Biden. At the Senate, he's really there to implement the president's policy. He leads a department that has been really weakened by all the budget cuts. Many officers have not yet been appointed, and since Kissinger, there is a tendency to centralization around the National Council. Ted Sullivan, who is someone who has different networks within the Democratic Party. He was in charge of the campaign for Hillary Clinton. He probably would have been appointed at the same position under Hillary Clinton. So many things are concentrated there, but deep down, I think the foreign policy that we are seeing, for example, the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, which not everyone agreed with, even Blinken himself may have chosen another timeline. This is a decision made by Joe Biden. He understands the new priorities for the U.S., and he is leading the way to make the policy change. I think we should never underestimate the weight of the president and the vision of the president in foreign policy. We saw that under Trump, when they pulled out of Syria. Trump was saying, once Daesh is down, I will withdraw. We've heard many people, even in Washington, saying, don't worry, the military, the army will contain him. It might work for a while, but then at the end of the day, the president is the one making the final decision. We saw this with Obama. We saw this with Trump also, and now with Joe Biden. Quickly now, I want to comment on a few points. Something's very important that I want to insist on. The U.S. is not on the decline. If we're looking at a demographic country, it's a country that is much younger than Europe, much younger than China. This country has a dynamic demography due to an integrated immigration. This country continues to innovate despite the divisions, the inequalities, the democratic crisis. I agree totally with what has been said. This democracy crisis is also true here. I've been in France. I feel a bit the same here, like a PSD symptom, and I've only been here in France for a few days. So this country has a capacity to recover in an exceptional manner. The prospects for 22, 23 are much higher than the ones before COVID. So this country is recovering much quicker and much richer from the COVID crisis. An economist wrote a book. He says, the opposite of fragile is not robust. It's something that is reinforcing itself through crisis. If we look at the crisis of 2008 with the trader methods, or the COVID crisis, which was not very well managed, or not well managed by Donald Trump initially, the country will actually come out stronger. I'm not sure we can say the same about the European Commission. If we look at the time it has taken us to start taking actions, I think we should be asking ourselves some questions. Another point about the U.S., I don't quite agree with the fact that Americans are more reliable. I think they are very reliable, only we don't want to listen to them. It's been 10 years now that the Americans have been talking about their new priorities, switching towards Asia, turning towards Asia since Obama. If Europeans do not want to increase their defense budget, we will not be interested and we will look elsewhere. And I think that's what we're seeing today. we are seeing these warnings, these threats coming to fruition. Barack Obama, at the end of his mandate, second mandate, gave an interview at the Atlantic talking about the British and the French of clandestine passengers. And I agree with what has been said. We need to draw conclusions from this at a European level, not necessarily against the Americans, but this is what will save our relationship with the US if we are able to have the economic, military way to reconcile with their power, which would require a total change of concept. The DNA of Europe is actually to transcend power, to replace power forces, to replace military forces through law and economy. For some of our partners in Germany or elsewhere, that requires a deep intellectual change. And that's another issue altogether. But if we want to be seen as reliable partners, as partners that can influence the US, it's up to us to do the job. Now, looking at this from Washington, it's not so much the position of Europe between the US and China. It's mainly the position of Europe with its surrounding regions. If we do get another crisis in Libya, in the Balkans, where Europeans were totally unable to do anything, or Belarus, or Syria, with the consequences that we know on the European institutions, the terrorist attacks, etc., I think Americans are actually telling us that this is no longer their priorities. If you listen to Joe Biden, when he spoke after the withdrawal of Afghanistan, he said, we are now going to focus on our vital interests, national vital interests. I think that will include Article 5 and NATO, because that's really part of the national order in America. But all the other crises around Europe, in those crises, we are very vulnerable. That could even have an impact on our institutions. And I think in that sense, we are alone. Nicole, you wanted to react to this? It's up to the Americans, to the Europeans now. How do you see this? It's up to the Europeans now. The ball is on their side. Americans have double language also. It's a bit like just, Okay. Nicole, what would you say about this?
Je voudrais d'abord dire un mot sur le leadership américain.
One word regarding the American leadership.
Pardon de vous interrompre.
Sorry, I need... And then we will move on to Q&A. So if you do have questions, please prepare them. America is back. We will lead again. That's what we heard.
Je crois que sa stratégie.
And the strategy, that's why I was talking about stupidity. There's something that I cannot understand. For the first 6 months, Biden was trying to re-establish a world leadership. In order to do this, he needed to re-establish a Western leadership, and he did that very well. He got from NATO a consensus for China. He obtained from the G20 another consensus on a more social-oriented capitalism. He took the initiative of a 15% tax on the benefits of the large companies, so he had the whole of the West behind him, which was extraordinary. And then beginning of July, it was as if someone else was taking the lead in Washington and doing the opposite, demolishing and destroying what he had just done, raising concern within NATO because of the withdrawal of Afghanistan and the China alliance, the Asian alliance in China, and is raising concern at NATO level, but also at a European level by resorting back to Trump bad habits, not only the reflex of unilateralism, but also a lack of competence. This man, who was presented to us as a great professional, who has been there for 40 years, has been piling on mistakes. 5,000 terrorists are now in the open nature because Americans opened the door to the Taliban. China has extraordinary contracts with Afghanistan, so we're a bit wary of this. This is totally
quelqu'un peut m'expliquer? Je ne sais pas si Suzanne est encore là. On voit
Misleading. I don't know if Suzanne is still here. Anyway, that's my first point. Now, concerning the Europeans, I keep on thinking and saying,
en janvier.
and I have a book coming out in January. Tomorrow's Europe will be changing. Europeans, what we call strategic autonomy of Europeans,
Souveraineté européenne.
or European sovereignty, it's not to react to such and such. It's not to take position against or for American politics, but it's to decide among ourselves. Our difficulty is not so much that we cannot have an army or that we cannot do something together, is that we don't know how to discuss together with us. I spent more than 10 years as part of the Council, European Council. We never had a meeting of our head of states in which they could sit around the table to say and sit and discuss which world are we living in, what is the world we want to live in 20 or 30 years. So the whole point of having Europeans discussing together, is this in our interest, for example, to follow China, or is it in our interest to have an autonomy in such and such aspect of foreign policy? That's what Europeans need to do. The challenge that Europeans are facing is to sit around a table and to decide together rather than wait what America is going to do in order to react for or against American interest, especially since Americans are very perverted when it comes to us. They ask us to follow them. On the one hand, the great challenge of the 21st century is China. We need to be joining arms, to be together, joining arms to counter this threat, whether it's a digital threat, a military threat from China. On the one hand, Americans ask us to support them, to spend for this. And on the other hand, they're saying, look, we don't care about your business, to do what you have to do. So I think Europeans, the only way really for Europeans to go about this is to sit together and to think together, what kind of future do we want, what kind of international relations do we want to have and develop. And I hope that the French presidency, the EU, every 14 years we have this presidency now, so we should not miss a moment. This is happening every 14 years, instead of having maybe a summit on the European defense. And it's a good thing, but I hope it won't be just talking about European defense, but a summit on how Europeans see the world. What kind of worlds do we want to see? I don't want us to waste time talking about battle group or other things.
Oui, bon, sur la bêtise américaine d'abord.
Regarding American stupidity,
Si idiot.
with Afghanistan, it might not be so silly to say, well, to say to the Chinese, well, do what you want to do with Afghanistan. Many Americans think that. What is a strategy, however, for Afghanistan is not necessarily a gain for China in that respect. What I wanted to say with Benjamin Haddad, I agree that the U.S. is a very tonic, dynamic country, and the true issue is a discrepancy between the political institution, really, and a country that remains very dynamic, very creative. Usually the most dangerous countries are the most dynamic countries. When you are tired, you're not so dangerous. If I look at this from a European point of view, I think the great challenge for Europeans is that Europe missed the data revolution. All the large data companies are Americans, which is a virtuous circle or cycle. They have succeeded in that revolution, and they're able to invest in the second revolution, which is the IA revolution. It's much easier to find support among the billionaires in America rather than Europe. It's a geopolitical issue in Europe. It's a question of whether Europe is going to be stuck between China, they have their own data facilities, or America, and the battle is going to be hard. It should be a priority for Europeans.
Thank you very much. We're now going to move on to the questions with the audience. If the audience has any questions for us.
Suzanne, en attendant.
Susan, perhaps, while people are preparing their questions. I don't know if you can still hear us, Susan.
Donc Nicole demandait.
Nicole was asking what was the position of the United States. Maybe you want to take the floor again, Nicole. I was saying that there's a discrepancy, a gap between the first months in the Biden presidency, where he tried to build a Western leadership. He succeeded at the G20, at the OECD, but so a sort of return to leadership in the Western world. But then in July, he just broke what he had started to build. He broke the trust with the NATO. NATO is at a difficulty in Afghanistan, and then he's worrying Europe about unilateralism. So there's a true contradiction between the first 6 months of his presidency and I hope a true contradiction with now. So could you provide us with an explanation?
Thanks so much for giving me the opportunity to come back into this conversation. I agree entirely with so many things that have been said by my fellow panelists, and I would look forward to hearing several of them respond to this point as well, because I know many of you spend a great deal of time in Washington. I would say that the criticism about the recent developments in the Biden administration's foreign policy, and particularly its attentiveness toward consultation with key partners and allies in Europe, is one that is in fact widely shared here in Washington. And there is a sense of disconnect, really, I think, between what we saw at the outset, very careful and very impressive coordination, and what has happened both with respect to Afghanistan and now with this new AUKUS alliance. I don't know that that is, in fact, a trend. I don't know that what we're seeing with these two very important missteps on the part of the Biden administration in terms of its engagement with Europe was intentional. But I think that it does suggest that the complexity of shifting essentially the kind of strategic calculus that had governed American foreign policy since 9/11, one that was very much focused on counterterrorism and the threat of instability across the broader Middle East, toward a very concerted and determined focus on great power competition, is not an easy shift to make, despite the fact that, intellectually these arguments have been well articulated in Washington and elsewhere over the course of several years now. To actually put in practice the policies that in fact underlie a focus on not just China, but this broader concern around great power competition, I think what we're seeing is just the birthing pains of a new U.S. strategic orientation. And what I hope is that there have been lessons learned by the administration. There have been efforts, of course, to try to address some of the concerns. But I think that, it would be a tremendous disservice, I think, to our shared strategic interests if what we saw was a judgment by European partners that the Biden administration was simply going to go its own way, and so Europe should do the same. I think, what the lessons of Afghanistan and AUKUS should be for all of us is that we need to work harder to try to ensure that we are well coordinated, that where we have differences, we're exploring them and managing them to the extent possible, not in the headlines of major newspapers, but in fact through the private diplomatic dialogue that has been such a key part of our success on major issues. And again, I just come back to Iran. We can't do this alone. You can't do it alone, as we saw in the early diplomacy on the Iran nuclear issue, and we can't do it alone, as we saw during the Trump administration in particular. And so it's absolutely essential that we do find a modus vivendi that is viable recognizing that we are not always going to have the same perspective on these critical issues.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Do we have any questions in the audience now? Yes, we have a lady with a question here. Wait a second, we're going to hand you the microphone. Hello. I would like to know to what extent the huge American debt has an influence. I don't know how this debt will be paid, first of all. So to what extent does it have an influence on foreign policy in the United States? Benjamin, perhaps? So this is a question we often ask about the relationship with China, China having American treasury bonds. So if the Chinese got rid of these bonds suddenly, the price would go down. And therefore, the American debt, the treasury bills, treasury bonds. So what is important is that the war in Afghanistan was only financed by the debt. Differently from other American wars in the past, there was an increase of the taxes for Vietnam or yes, the war in Afghanistan was the war in Iraq, and these are wars that are based on debt, which means that the American people has not felt the financial weight of war. It didn't feel the human weight because these were professional soldiers, and that finally there were few losses. But foreign policy was disconnected from the interior life in the United States, and that is also very dangerous to some extent because it means that it could explain a certain volatility of the American policy, which is not necessarily rooted in a deep interior debate. The last example being the AUKUS example, which is unsettling France deeply. And I have been away from the United States for 15 days, but I believe that we need to be an aficionado of international policy to have heard about it in the United States. A quick word on the debt. It is not a constraint in terms of financials because the United States are still finding financing. When we look at the interest rates, for example, we see the weight of the dollar that only increased in the last 15 years. And if the reserves of the central world banks, if we look, it is amusing, the weight of the debts on the GDP, they are very far from the Maastricht criteria. And this is what we call the privilege in France of the dollar that helps them finance war or great projects for different infrastructures. On the other hand, it's an internal issue. And sometimes for the financing of the debt and deficit, this led to paralysis, political paralysis of the government. And this, in time, could have an impact on foreign policy.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Do we have another question in the room? Yes, we have a gentleman with a question here.
Bonjour.
Hello. I'm the president of the European movement in Paris. So I'm interested, of course, in international questions, American questions in particular. I wanted to tell Mr. Haddad that there is an ambassador of the United States in France who was appointed in July. Her name is Denise Campbell-Power. Yes, but she hasn't been confirmed yet. Well, the embassy has invited us to contact her. So, anyhow, that's not what I wanted to say here. This morning, you were lucky, says Nicole. So we heard from the French ambassador that Americans had overestimated the capacity of the government, the Taliban's, not the government, the Afghan government, to resist to the Taliban's. And what I wanted to say is that in 1979, I was in Iran at the time of the fall of the Shah, and the same thing exactly happened at the time. I was very close to the French services and American services, and it was exactly the same situation. So I'm wondering how it will work.
Alors, c'est une question qu'on se pose tous.
That's a question we all are wondering about in a permanent way. I don't know if someone wants to answer. Benjamin Haddad knows how Syria works.
En fait, la réponse très
In
simple.
fact, a simple answer is that often when we have a choice between the plot theory or sometimes you have to choose
CIA,
competence. CIA, like other bodies, it's often heavy, difficult, it takes time, you mix up your desire with reality. And for Afghanistan, where the United States has invested a lot, injected so much money, so much human investment as well in the support to the government, the Afghan government, and in the training of the security Afghan forces, perhaps they didn't want to see or understand the quickness with which these security forces and government were going to crumble. So I'm talking now under the authority of our ambassador, but perhaps some European countries had a less sentimental approach, and they didn't need to be convinced. But the failures of the intelligence services, when we look, of course, at the massive destruction weapons, there was a political agenda to push this storytelling by the Bush administration, but there was a consensus within the intelligence agencies and saying, yes, Saddam Hussein is trying to have access to massive destruction weapons. And so the French reaction, that's a smaller subject for the Americans, but they didn't see things coming. For us, there was this trade aspect. Okay, the French lost a deal, but the Australians had already told them, that's what the Australians said to the Americans, they had totally forgotten or the strategic importance that this agreement had, or this contract had for France, that the bilateral relationship with the French presence in the Pacific for the French elite and the French politicians. So, of course, it was important, and it was a total stupefaction for the American administration. No, if it wasn't a CIA, if it was only a CIA problem, it would be less serious. It is a general problem, I believe, of American diplomacy, who has problems stepping in other people's shoes. And in Afghanistan, even more in Iraq, I think only 15% in the State Department who spoke Arabic. So it's not only a question of intelligence, it's a question of difference of culture of the American administration and the result of a belief, perhaps an idealistic belief, to think that they are the exceptional nation, that they understand the rest of the world, and that the rest of the world must respect or conform to the American policies. And indeed, they didn't know anything about Iraq. There was the idea that democracy would be brought to Iraq, and the French were the first to say that has no sense, makes no sense. And the Soviets had even said it was complicated in the past, and they hadn't imagined for a second that our reaction could be a political, cultural one, and not only a commercial one. So I think that goes beyond a failure in American intelligence. I think it's almost a failure of superior teaching that they have for the interest of the foreign world. And I know what Jean-Marie is going to say, but they say, yes, America is the most open democracy. Before what Jean-Marie will say, you say we didn't see it coming. Of course, the French didn't see anything coming either. So I don't know how the secret services in France work, the intelligence services work here. Just a word, it's not exact. either, because we asked questions to the Australians, the Americans, and apparently we were reassured.
Oui, oui, moi j'allais dire ce que tu viens de
I
dire.
was going to say what you said. The services didn't really know. We could wonder, perhaps they took too seriously the fact that you cannot spy on allies. And that was a source of tensions between the United States and France at some point. What I believe is that in the United States, in this case, this Afghan case, there also was a lack of understanding, psychological understanding of the impact that it would have on the Afghan troops, that the Americans were leaving, and that was difficult to measure, but it is one important dimension. And I also believe, and that should make us reflect, because we also work in other fields, and the way we support an army is important. And I'm also talking against under the control of our ambassador in Kabul. But from what I saw when I was at the UN, and I often traveled to Afghanistan at that time, I went back some time after, but it was a model of support in which there was a lot of aircraft support. So when you have this aircraft support, we were used to it, and then there are no means to fight when it's gone. We externalized on the logistics support a lot, everything that helps an army work and function when contractors, private companies left. The soldiers are naked, without food, without munitions. Nothing can work. They're not paid anymore. There's, of course, high corruption. And this is a model that is not adapted to armies that must last in time. And when the support that is provided is removed, they can crumble. So I think there are lessons to learn for our military cooperation before blaming the Americans on the failures in Afghanistan. In the future, we must really be careful with the way France is managing the support also. So do we have one last question? Yes. At the back of the room, I believe someone wants to ask a question.
Bonjour.
Hello. I just wanted to talk about the migratory policy. For me, I remember how it was under the Trump administration, and I'd like to know what it's going to be like under the Biden administration. We thought it would be more human, but deportation towards Haiti was very shocking. I just wanted to know if you considered it as a challenge for American policy also. Yes, that is very topical, absolutely. Who wants to answer? A quick word. I think that you are right. We see more continuity between Trump and Obama than we already had with Barack Obama, who spoke about it less than Trump, but we had people sent back to the borders, or at least to sort of camps where families were separated, and we already saw that when Barack Obama was president. There's a tragedy, of course, because this is a geopolitical topic, and every single administration is confronted to these obstacles. And we see now that the Republican tried to attract the Hispanic electorate, and I think that a big part of Bush's electorate have tried to push towards a reform, and now we see an opposite trend. Sometimes I think it will be more complicated to find an agreement, and of course what we see is that there will be crises that are managed in the best way possible. And we saw what happened in Haiti recently. We talked about it extensively. Yes, it's a very good illustration of the ideological change of the Republican Party. This is a trend in the United States. We have 2 minutes left in case we have another question.
Rassasié, moi,
No. I was curious to close. It was, we talked about European defense, about the role that wanted or didn't want to assume the Europeans in the communiqué that
de réconciliation.
Mr. Macron
Il y a
sent. I think there's one clear sentence, or one clear sentence on European defense. I will give Nicole the floor. Do you think that this will lead to something, or are these just simple words? First, I don't know, says Nicole. I believe that if it is something about the submarines, the gap is huge between the two subjects, and maybe the future French presidency was happy to give the idea that the Americans provided their blessing, but they didn't want to go too far in the European defense because they are afraid it would weaken NATO and it would anger the Americans. So it would not be good for their own security interests. If, thanks to this communiqué,
dans la défense européenne, parce que vous voyez, les Américains.
In this release, in this statement, if they said, yes, we got the green light from Biden to go for it, we could think that some Europeans would be less uneasy. And I think this is very rhetorical. And I don't think that it is the trigger for a new period in terms of European defense. I think that this question is a tree hiding the forest, and this is not the subject. It's not European army. It's foreign policy. It's the vision of the world in Europe, and the Europeans, before having a common army or ships or missile launchers. There's no use in having the best army in the world if you disagree in the way to use it and in terms of objectives. So this is why I believe that European defense, which was one of the great subjects at the end of the 90s, today, once again, it's a tree hiding the forest. It's Benjamin, the last words. So I don't quite agree, because I believe that to be able to respond to crises and threats that we have in our environment, perhaps it's just a rhetorical concession, but it's a way maybe to push them and deliver actions, because the Americans have always been schizophrenic about defense, defending Europe, but they said, oh, maybe it's the moment to change things, and it could have an impact for some of our European partners in Berlin, Stockholm, for Warsaw, who are worried about competition with the Atlantic Alliance and NATO. There are technical aspects on defense, but from a political point of view, if Biden sends a clear message to say, go, it is in our interest to have an autonomous defense, this could create a certain dynamics, but it will depend on the feeling of emergency. And I think that the vision of France is not necessarily a shared one. As we say,
Merci beaucoup.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Susan Maloney, for having been with us today. Jean-Marie, Nicole, Benjamin, thank you very much.